My name is Rashida Scar. I am a librarian with Fairfax Library in Marin. And we have partnered with SURJ Marin, Standing Up for Racial Justice, in order to bring you this series of events called Demystifying Affordable Housing through a social justice lens. And today's our last event was how we got here, where we discussed kind of as a country, how did we end up in this place? And this week we're discussing why is Marin still so white? And we're kind of discussing some of the redlining and exclusionary covenants that may have brought us to this place where we are now, as well as contemporary issues that are preventing Marin from reflecting the diversity of the region as compared to the other areas in the Bay Area. As we're getting started here, I just want to let you know you will be muted. When you chat, you'll be communicating with us leaders and co-hosts. That's something that we are doing just to keep the conversation flowing in one direction. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A at the end where you can share your questions in the chat, and we will read them and give our panelists time to respond. So as we are going now, I'm kind of going from my notes here. The next session in the series, the next event in the series will be school segregation. And the connection between school segregation and housing segregation. And this is something that is relevant to Marin, and we'll be discussing that during our next meeting, which is happening January 15th at 2 p.m. So stay tuned for that. We'll post links to all of this stuff in the chat, and we will also, you'll get an email at the end, at the beginning of next week that has all the links that I'm sharing with you right now. We have book lists for each event. So there is a book list for this event, and I will share the link with that in the chat as well. But first, I'm going to introduce our panelists for today. The first person I want to introduce is Royce McLemore. And I'm going to, there you go. This is Royce, everyone. So just to share a little bit about Royce, she is a dynamic activist who, along with several other women in her community, founded the nonprofit Women Helping All People, whose mission is to provide low-income Marin residents, particularly those in public housing, with information, support services, and educational opportunities that develop self-esteem, economic self-sufficiency, and a sense of community. She is also a lifelong resident of Golden Gate Village community in Marin, and she is the current president of the Golden Gate Village Residents Council. She's also a member of the Marin County Resident Advisory Board for Affordable Housing. And Royce is a vocal advocate for the elderly, the disabled, youth, and people forced to live in the margins of Marin life, and represents these communities in both public and private spheres. So welcome, Royce.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Our other panelist today is Lucia Martel Dow. Lucia was born and raised in Venezuela. Over the course of her life, Lucia has served as a member of the Venezuelan Foreign Service, a human rights and immigration advocate in Spain and Europe, as a holder of both a Master's of Laws degree from University of California, as well as a Master's in International Law and Relations from University Complutense of Madrid. And she has served as a Director of Immigration and Social Services at Canal Alliance. Currently, she's a trustee with the San Rafael City School Board of Education, commissioner for First Five Marin, and as a board member of Ritter Center based in San Rafael. Lucia has recently joined the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, ILRC, as Director of New Americans Campaign. where she continues to advocate fiercely for immigrants and new residents in Marin County. So welcome, Lucia. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Rashida. It's a pleasure to be here and being with the other panelists. Thank you.
Wonderful. So next, Barbara, one of our SURJ Marin folks, is going to come forward and she's going to share a little bit about who SURJ Marin is and what they do.
Thank you, Rashida. My name is Barbara Kaler, and I want to welcome all of you and thank you all for coming. We appreciate you. I want to give a little bit of introduction to SURJ and to SURJ Marin. The acronym SURJ stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice, and SURJ is a national network that a national network, and SURJ Marin is a chapter of that network, and it organizes white people for racial justice. We are 100% volunteer led. We welcome people of all races and ethnicities, focused on challenging and dismantling white supremacy in all its myriad forms, which is internal, external, interpersonal, structural, systemic, organizational. And we take our leadership from and hold ourselves accountable to the local Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations and community leaders in working against the racial disparities here in Marin County. We have relationships with 3 organizations this year. One is the Multicultural Center of Marin. The second is the Marin City Arts and Culture. And the third is Marin County Cooperation Team. We have a website, surj.org, SURJMARIN, where you can find a lot more information about SURJ and events and actions that you can participate in, and we welcome you to check that out. And we are grateful for you to be here. Thank you. And I want to say that Lisa B. is here too from SURJ.
As is Chelsea Subowit. She's here and she's running things in the background. So she'll be helping with sharing information with you guys today. Next, we have Lisa. Lisa is going to be sharing with us a land acknowledgement and also offer some action items that you can do to be an advocate for Indigenous rights. Lisa?
Thank you. SURJ Marin offers land acknowledgements before meetings to sort of ground ourselves in where we are and give ourselves the time and space to settle in before we begin the work at hand. So here we go. As you settle in and slow down before we begin our meeting, I want you to connect with your physical body. How does it feel? What is achy? What is off? What is sore? What feels great? Are you hungry, full, tired, alert? Take a few breaths to check in. Rest your shoulders, rest your belly. This connection you feel to your body should reflect the connection you feel to the land around you. This is the connection that people native to this land have always felt about it. There is no distinction between the person and the land. When land is colonized, the land we are on was colonized from the Miwok people. And when land is colonized, it creates an illness of disconnection to the land and thus disconnection to ourselves and the humanity that lives within us. When we acknowledge the land, we are called to acknowledge that within us which is so deeply interconnected to each other and to nature. When settlers took over this land, they lost their way, both internally and externally, morally and physically. They created harm, they took without gratitude, they claimed ownership over land that is not owned. They created monuments to their heroes who represented the highest of their hollow achievements. Right here in our community in San Rafael, a great harm has been done by a colonizer in the form of the church. When the wounds of 1,000 generations came forth on Indigenous Peoples' Day last year, the statue of a colonizer was toppled. Those who were acting on behalf of the grief of their people are now subject to further harm by a system without justice. To right this injustice, to show solidarity and support of the defense of the Indigenous Peoples' Day 5, we will send you a link to this, but there's a link called ip5solidarity.org, where you can make calls, donate, and sign their petition. And as you continue with your work today, be grateful for the small things. Be compassionate with yourself. Be fierce in the face of injustice. And mostly, remember how all of our humanity is connected to each other and to the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We are going to be sharing the links to opportunities where you can support the Legal Defense Fund for those Indigenous youth, as well as links to support all of the organizations that you're going to encounter today during this event. So thank you again, Lisa, for sharing that. And so we also wanted to mention that there may be opportunities for a National Day of Mourning taking place possibly at the end of this month for Indigenous people. And we're going to, I will email out links for that information once we know more. So stay tuned for that as well. And I think we are ready to start the film portion of our event. We're going to be showing a series of short films. Chelsea, can you put the agenda up just so people can see what we're going to be doing? The first film that we're going to be watching is called Why We Come. Then we're going to be watching a film called Coming Home. And the final film we're watching is called Past, Present, and Promises. And these will discuss some of the issues that come into play when we're talking about people of color here in Marin. So without further ado, I would like to start Why We Come, and Chelsea's going to share that on her screen.
As you can see here, the statistics are quite not surprising, but definitely shocking when you're able to see it face to face. So when you break it down by race, white people make up 72.3% of Marin County. And when you actually add up all the other races, it is still 2.5 times more white people than there are any other race. And so we wanted to also account for specific categories within housing. There's many other interesting categories that are listed in race counts, but we focused on housing, and there were 7 major indicators that they used to gather that data. And so for some background, that all of this data from race counts was collected from the American Community Survey, and it was over a 5-year estimate from 2010 and to 2014. And so yeah, so we looked at income left after housing, post-rent income, and home ownership by race. And so to begin with post-rent income, after paying for rent in Marin County, Latinx households only kept $16,367, while white households kept $59,304. And so as you can see from that, with the access of being able to that money that's left over is very limited in comparison to what white household had in terms of access. And so what that difference came out to was about 70.2% and 75.1% for other races compared to white households. And home ownership by race, there was a 69.4% of white households with access to home ownership, while when you compare it to the Black and Latina population, it was 28.8 and 29.4. And so as you can see, when we start to see these numbers and then pair it with the lived experiences, there are some major inequalities, and especially when it comes to housing in Marin County.
Thanks, Chelsea. So with that in mind, I'm going to start talking to our panelists. I would like to start with Lucia. Lucia, can you share a little bit about your personal story of living in Marin?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and thank you again for the invitation to be here and spend the afternoon with you all and hearing these great videos and some of the stories that I am so honored to be part of, you know, a community of people that have been really on the forefront of fighting for equality and in housing rights, not only in Marin, but whatever happens here also impacts California and the United States. So my personal experience, I have to say that in my view, this is a little bit of a tricky question because, you know, at the intersectionality of a lot of these things, some of the experiences are definitely different depending on what kind of income you have or what situational position you are, right, in society. So I am extremely lucky and fortunate that when I came to the United States, I got married. So my path to the United States was because of love. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but the reason why I'm here is because I married someone from San Francisco who grew up in San Francisco and whose parents were able to buy a house in the 50s in San Francisco with a salary of a nurse working at UCSF. And interestingly enough, that was almost like a one-person breadwinner home because my husband's dad was actually the stay-home father and the mom was actually the breadwinner as a nurse. And with that, they were able to buy a home in a good area in San Francisco, quote unquote good area, meaning the housing prices now have obviously, after 40 years, become, you know, an investment that allowed my husband to be able to fund a house in Marin County. So we have been very lucky that both of us, because we're professionals and are able to have a professional, you know, career, we're able to pay the mortgage, but we wouldn't have been able to get our foot in Marin County if it weren't because his white family was able to build wealth based on a house that actually is what paid for his college and also paid for the home we are, well, the initial payment, the down payment of our current home. So I like to tell that story because sometimes, you know, people think, well, maybe it's because you have a good salary, you have a good job, but quite frankly, I wouldn't have been able to do anything if it wasn't because you come down with cash to actually be able to pay a home based on a loan that somebody else got. So it is for me, is the perfect example of how the wealth that you are not able to create based on ownership has had such a big impact on people from different backgrounds and race and ethnicity. So being in Marin County has been you know, as an immigrant and as somebody who has experiences living in other countries like myself, where I obviously also came from a country where my safety and security and the quality of living was very low. You come to a place to Marin County and you come to appreciate the beauty of the place, how welcoming people can be. But at the same time, I was, through my previous job at Canal Alliance, able to see firsthand for about 6 years what the differences between my life and the privilege that I was enjoying as a homeowner versus the experiences that other people were having, specifically to the canal. And I could speak to other areas, but I feel that's the one that I have more expertise on, could see the difference between both. I have felt overall that there is a spirit in Marin to change things. And then there's this idea that everybody understands there's a problem. But my experience has been mixed in the sense that people know there's progress to be made, but sometimes we're very timid around solutions. So although my personal experience, because of, again, a situation that it's very personal, my experience is obviously not the same and contrasts a lot with the opportunities that I have seen other people not be able to enjoy in Marin County.
I think that as your story perfectly illustrates what happens when people are able to build wealth through home ownership. and the stepping stones that allows them to then transfer that wealth into new areas, especially areas that are as expensive as Marin is. So I think that's a beautiful illustration. Royce, I'm going to ask you the same question. Can you share a little bit about your personal experience living in Marin and working in Marin for around these issues?
My story began when my grandparents and my dad and my mother came to San Francisco during the Great Migration, and we lived in San Francisco. My grandmother had two sisters who was doing housework and day work here in Marin County. She told my grandmother about Marin City, because we all lived on 2814 Pine Street, which was our family, house. So my grandmother came over and, paid 2 months rent and went back and told my daddy, who's her son, that we were coming to Marin City and she had paid the rent and you were going to either root, hog, or die. It was over. And so that's how I got to Marin City. We got here at about 1945. My younger brother was a baby. I was 3, 2, and 1, almost 1. We lived up on the hill in Marin City, which is now called like the Headlands, and in the wartime houses. And that's where we stayed until I was about 16. Lived in Marin City, went to school, partially in Marin City School, left, was able to go to a Christian school in San Francisco that my grandmother wanted to send me to. Came back, went to Tam High, and graduated from Tam. Just in reflecting in terms of what was it like? Well, that was all of what it was. I mean, we lived in a Black community because during that time people had moved out, and it was just mainly all Black people. And the businesses, I remember from when they were the white drugstore and Bryce Brothers Market, but something happened. I was young, I don't know what happened, but the next thing I know, those stores closed, and the next thing there were Black businesses. All of our businesses were Black businesses, and that was just a way of life. We didn't, as growing up, didn't really travel outside of, let me go hang out in Mill Valley or this, that, and the other. We more or less stayed within our community because it was self-sustaining, and it was what it was. And I didn't leave until I was 20 when I got married. Didn't come into, really into who I am until, the day of Stokely Carmichael, etc. And, that's when I came into my Blackness. And we came back to Marin City to have our children here. And then I left again. Was very active at that time. I was about 27. Very active in the Sausalito School District. But when I left and came back in 1976 is when I came back. I came back, after living in Berkeley for 3.5 years, just so engrossed with being around, my Black people. And then when I came back to Marin in 76, being that, oh, yes, back to the whiteness. But I came in a different light because during that 3.5 period in Berkeley I had an actually born again experience, a real one. And upon coming back, I saw the racism, the way that it was, is, and I hope maybe one day it shall not forever be. But I had a different outlook on it, you know, and even compassion, because I looked at it that, you know, these people who just, you know, want to talk crazy and do different things because of who they are. But I just looked at them as they're really the ones that are lost, and they're lost and don't even know that they are lost. And so people looked at me differently because I know who I am, and I know that I'm, you know, equal to. So then they, you know, a lot of people deem me as, you know, wanting to be just arrogant, or, you know, just a strong Black woman is who I am. And so they couldn't understand it. And then, you know, and I got involved with different things. From in the 80s was when crack cocaine came in our community. You know, I fought against, you know, against that, although my family was plagued with it, because it is so small here. And I had been involved with the schools before I left, but, you know, the racism was very thick and deep, and I could, you know, and it's still the same way today, 50 years later. So, but when I came back, I didn't want to waste my time in a racist institution. I learned my lesson. And so what I did when I was in Berkeley was able to be creative and start my own school. When we came back to Marin, I actually did homeschooling before it was a thing to do, until I think my 4 younger ones, they were in the 10th grade, the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade before they ever went to public school. I embraced the beauty of Marin City, that what I took for granted all my life. How just beautiful, and the hills, and, you know, just embraced it. And, you know, a mother on welfare at this point in time. But I said, where else can you live in Marin on a fixed income and enjoy all the amenities of the wealthy? And so, and that's what, you know, I doing and will do, because I tell people, you don't have to be rich to enjoy open space. You know how in one, if you're poor, stack you up and with the rats and roaches and all of that. But no. And, you know, so I began just to live the life of appreciation and thankfulness for being here. One of the ones that were able to come back to Marin City. Now, you know, a little fast forwarding, it hasn't really, you know, it has changed just a little bit, but not really. Who has changed is just me within myself, and the way that I, you know, look upon things. In Marin City, we used to, back in the day, call it, you know, the Golden Ghetto, and it was a hidden secret. And we, as those that lived in Marin City, we wanted to keep it that way, because this was our little niche. And, but, you know, things happen. People, our elders began to die off. As they were dying off, their children couldn't wait till it cooled down before they were selling their parents' homes. We were the only people that could afford to buy them were white people at, you know, at that time, or even now that it's really escalated. And so that's how gentrification began in Marin City. To the point now we are a minority in our own community. And those of us that have been here through it all, you know, we don't care, because it's still our community. So with that being said, that there is thought and talk of how to you know, recreate and bring back those that have been displaced. I know that there is a move to rid Black people out of Marin County. Very much aware of it, because back in the day when they built Golden Gate Village, they built it for the people who were left behind that said they weren't going anywhere.
Right.
These people were the workforce of this county. We're no longer workforce. So there's no need for us really in this county with the powers that be. And even though, we've done and helped contribute and build this country, as Black people being survivors of the Middle Passage, those that you see today are the survivors of it. We still have many obstacles to overcome. And even with the Black on Black crimes, that's just still, festering from self-hate within oneself. So I'm believing that one day it's going to be the big giant is going to wake up in Black people, and where we'll be able to stand and be strong. And as you look at Marin City, a lot of people are just stuck on Golden Gate Village, but that whole entire valley is our valley.
Absolutely.
And right. And so it could be an opportunity to, a lot of people that have bought in, because Golden Gate Village, they were told, was going to be torn down. But once they see that it's not going to be torn down, but it's going to be revitalized and people, a renaissance of our community, I predict, and on this, you can just mark this day, that there will be another white exodus in Marin City. And, and that will be an opportunity for many people, Black people who left Marin City, an opportunity to be able to come back home. And this day right now is sort of bittersweet, because there was a going home celebration for one of the elderly people here. And before we just started on here, I got a call from a family member who said that a family that I was raised up with, that they came here for the homegoing celebration, hadn't seen them in about 30, almost 40 years. So, when people come, they come wanting to be here and staying and loving and talking about how we were raised. So
I love that.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing that. And I think in your story, there were several points that we can kind of bring up, specifically, the ways in which there is a divestment, there's an uninvestment in these communities. You talked about all the white businesses leaving and how that created an opportunity for Black businesses to come in, which is amazing. And
they didn't have to have MBAs. They just had the willingness to work.
And that's like the pathway to building wealth, right? Being able to start at a one level and be able to build your way up to another level. And how gentrification kind of breaks up that ability for people of color to kind of build up that wealth and stay in their communities rather than have to leave because it's gotten too expensive. So
I just want to add that one little point there, because this Marin City, USA, when redevelopment became urban removal, and that we had a flea market, world-renowned flea market in Marin City, and that closed to make way for redevelopment. And people were told that they would be able to have their own businesses again, but that never happened. In fact, so I'm seeing an opportunity to bring back that, Black businesses in Marin City.
I
one
love
day.
that. I'm going to have some more questions for you about that in a moment. But I want to switch to Lucia, and I'll try to go back and forth between the two of you. You know, as we showed on the slide before, the most recent race count study has shown that Marin is still the most racially disparate county in the Bay Area. How have you seen this illustrated in the communities that you work with?
Yeah, so yeah, this is complicated, right? Because one of the things is that we have seen that in other places in Marin County, for example, San Rafael, and I just want to kind of frame it in a way that it's very connected to the theme of today's presentation, because definitely there is, depending when you're in Marin County, a prevalence of white people or Latinos or Black folks, Asian, and I think that one of the area that I'm most familiar with, which is San Rafael, it's an area that has become incredibly, well, not, I wouldn't say incredibly diverse, but more diverse than the other places, as you know, except for Marin City and other places like Novato. So those urban areas within Marin tend to be much more diverse, so than the rest of Marin County, right? And also San Rafael in particular is the most populated city in Marin County, and it has about 30% of the population is Latino. So when you kind of zoom in and go back, you know, don't zoom out so much in Marin County, but go into San Rafael, the equation there, it's a little bit different. And I just want to point that out because I think it's important to highlight that is obviously not by accident, in the sense that there's obviously the folks that have come to the United States, immigrated to Marin, are absolutely coming to an area like the Canal area, where they historically have been welcomed by family members, by a vibrant immigrant community, by services that are provided for immigrants that live there, like Canal Alliance, you know, Marin Community Clinics. There's all this spectrum of services where if you are an immigrant new to this country, there's schools and there's all sorts of resources that you can access. But the problem with that is that we have created a concentration and segregation by the way we have designed the housing for that specific community in San Rafael. And I want to talk, because sometimes when we talk about Latinos, you know, there's so much embedded in there. It's an income class, it's immigration status, it's all these things combined, right? Like it will be hard for me to put myself exactly in that category because it's a little bit different, right? So one of the things is I think we have to kind of frame it in a way that it's for particularly low income or folks that have immigrated from Latin America with lower education level, and there are in the Canal area. So it is very difficult for someone who arrives in Marin County to be able to build any kind of wealth around housing. And the number one reason is obviously cost, right? So it is basically impossible to rent or even purchase a home, not only in Marin County. This is a problem just, you know, all over the Bay Area. But San Rafael has something very specific, and the area of the Canal has something very specific, which is the density, the high density that people are experiencing currently in the Canal. That area is not significantly cheaper than another part of Marin County. The issue is that people are living in congregated housing apartments, mostly apartments. And that is that has contributed to the fact that there's 10,000, 12,000 people living in the Canal area in housing that is subpar. That is, we're not talking about affordable housing, which is in that sense is different than the wonderful story about Golden Gate and Village, and then we can talk about why. I hope we could have some time to know what we can do about that. But in that, and specifically, that we're not talking about affordable housing. We're talking about privately owned housing that has been rented and sub-rented and subletted. In one family, one apartment can have 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment. So we have also conditions, obviously, that are subpar because there are people living in apartments that have very little ventilation, that carpets might be old, like 40 years old. They could be mold, appliances are old, like there's no laundry services, almost very difficult transportation. I cannot even tell you about parking. So there are, and also we cannot forget that this area in the canal in particular, it's underserved in so many ways. One of the things that when we talk about, when we talk about desegregated communities is what is happening. If you think about it, that area of the canal is where a lot of the industry, and talking about environmental justice, is located in the canal. Car shops, and also the landfill are also located in that neighborhood, right? And on top of that, we have very little green space. The canal area has very little green space. And sometimes one of the jokes that we have is that it's easier to bring an immigrant, get an immigrant out of detention than getting a soccer field rented in San Rafael, because there could be the pickleweed soccer field, but it's almost impossible to have any kind of youth activities done in that area. So it is incredibly dense based on the conditions and based on the fact that it is very difficult for immigrants to get any kind of housing. So subsidized housing is out of the question unless you have a green card or potentially a US citizenship. And you cannot rent anywhere else because the formality of rental agreements in the United States requires credit check, requires, for example, that you have not received an eviction notice or an eviction order. You cannot have that in your record. And you have to have, unemployment, Social Security, etc. And even there's folks who may have US citizenship or lawful permanent resident or legal status in the United States, but all the other structural barriers around renting, it's very difficult for immigrants to overcome. So it is a very complicated issue when we talk about that, but I wanted to highlight that because there is diversity in San Rafael, but we have segregated that diversity in a way that doesn't allow for mobility or access to other types of wealth based on the conditions of housing and the environmental conditions around housing that we have for folks like that. So I hope that answers your question, but I wanted to give it a little bit of background on what happens in this particular neighborhood. And so that folks should know that, and Royce, I'm so glad you were talking about gentrification, right? Because I don't know if folks know, but the bowling alley in the canal, right, that it's around right in front of the restaurant Celia, that has been sold. Like that's going to be developed in apartments. So we are going to start seeing a change, dramatic change in the canal area. And on top of that, it has been named rename an opportunity zone. So that is actually rich people can come in and buy properties and do it tax-free for, I don't know, 10 years or something like that. So people are going to start making investments in that particular neighborhood because it has been named opportunity zone. And that could have a absolute devastating effect on displacement of families that are currently living in that area.
Thank you for sharing that. These are issues, like you say, that are systemic and they're built in the restrictions that you're talking about for renting. It is both historical and systemic. The reason why there's a Golden Gate Village and the reason why the canal is organized the way it is organized, that is all decisions that were made by Marin government. That really points to the fact that I think a lot of times we want to say, oh, this is a personal choice issue. It is a matter of, work ethic or something else, or a personal failing on the families who are most impacted by these horrible government decisions that keep them locked into poverty. But they're also needing to we need to find solutions that do not punish people for trying to live, but that we see them as neighbors and help them live, and because they are our neighbors. So I'm going to field the next question to Royce. Royce, it sounds like you've lived in San Francisco, Berkeley, you've lived around the Bay Area. how would you compare living in Marin with life in the wider Bay Area? What are the differences? What do you see Marin doing that maybe some of the other areas are not doing, or vice versa?
Well, and back when lived in San Francisco, as well as in Berkeley, it was before the big gentrification in both San Francisco as well as in the East Bay. So upon coming back, in fact, I went to Berkeley a couple of months ago, and it just broke my heart to see, the homeless situation. I was in Oakland about 6 months ago, and to see all the camp cities and see all the Black people that are just living on the street. It's not like how it was when I was living there. I came back in '76. So, but the circumstances are probably the same, because that whole, West Oakland, and well, throughout Oakland, that was thriving Black communities, and it's where the Black movement in the Bay Area with the Black Panther Party and all of that was, so that's why I wanted to be there. I wanted to be in the hub of things there. But upon returning here, and like I said, seeing it still to this day, how it is, there is, at least not in government at all, but there is a movement that I could see within the past year, that there are a group of Marin County residents who are addressing the racism within and around them. And, so that would be, like, it's a work in progress. Is how I look at it, but there are some people are searching out themselves.
Mhm.
and their privilege.
Absolutely.
So just, there is some movement there.
Mhm.
And a little sidebar, we have a white family that was, their mother was raised partially here, but she's houseboat, but she had 2 sons, 2 twins. And it's really funny because they were just raised in a Black community. And, but they know how to, rise to the occasion with their white privilege. And so it's a joke that I share with them. I said, because they're able still to get jobs
Yeah.
that are, young Black men can't get. And so I just tell them, oh, so you had to rise to the occasion and pull down on your white privilege, huh? They'd laugh and say, uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. As I was raised in Oakland as well. So I have seen some of those same changes. And I think that goes to show that folks who are low income, they don't disappear when they're moved out of their housing, when they can no longer afford to live in these areas. They just move onto the street. So, and I think that's fueling a lot of the same issues that we're seeing throughout the Bay Area. Marin is not immune to that at all. I think a far more, especially in light of the pandemic, where you see, Lucia, you mentioned folks, 3 families to an apartment. How does that affect, transmission rates? When you're living on the streets, how does that affect transmission rates? Having a space to live is one of those things that keeps our entire community healthy. And so when you're talking about some of these changes that you're seeing that are kind of rippling up towards Marin, I feel like the COVID really is showing us how we need to change our priorities and make housing for all people a priority. So thank you for sharing that. That's beautifully stated. This next question is for Lucia. After hearing about the horrendous human rights violations at our border, and after several intense years that have highlighted very real financial, social, and physical abuses leveled against people of color in this country, there is renewed discussion surrounding the idea of reparations for those who have been harmed so deeply. What are your thoughts about this? And how do you dream something like this would look in the communities that you are a part of?
Yeah, what a great question. And, you know, when we talk about reparation, it's so hard not to recommend to the audience, if they haven't read it already, the case for reparations from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yes.
So the case for reparations is one of those articles. It was in the Atlantic, I think around 2014. I actually revisited the article before showing up for this panel, because talks about reparation in the context of housing. And he said, well, I chose housing because that is probably one of the most blatant examples of one of those moments where considering reparations seems so obvious, right? And convincing people that reparations is an option, and it's an obligation, a moral obligation of the United States, is probably one of those things that that essay in particularly brought up the conversation. But reparations is not a new concept. So it didn't to be a new concept in the United States for certain people, but it's not a new concept in the context of human rights.
Right.
My training is in human rights law, in international human rights law, and reparations in the international context are actually quite common. Like, well, quite common for those countries that actually are trying to become part of a world order in which human rights are part of the equation, and you are accountable towards violating those human rights. That is a very complicated thing to do, but there has been a lot of examples of countries or international courts and international tribunals who have ordered reparations, and the financial reparations, and there are all the types of reparations, but financial reparations to people because of human rights violations. That has happened even in the Latin America and the American continent, or the Americas, like we say in the United States. It's something that is not a new concept.
Right.
In the United States, we have obviously a history. It's a little bit more complicated because our political system is not necessarily based on this international universal values around human rights. We are based mostly on this political civil rights system in a constitution that only limits civil rights mostly around civil and political liberties, where economic and financial rights are usually not recognized at the same level. That is a very interesting discussion. I know it's not the subject of this panel, but it is important to recognize that, for example, the right to housing is not recognized in the United States as a civic right, as a civil liberty. And that is one of the obstacles of actually creating a framework in which you could potentially work around the reparations, right? But at the same time, you could potentially do a reparations that is targeted locally, that is specific to certain communities, and that can involve both accountability that is symbolic, such as, for example, Marin County could officially, they haven't done so, ask for forgiveness and apologize to the Black community in Marin County for the housing policies that did not allow them to live in this county. That is a symbolic reparation, but that could potentially have a very big impact, because then you're assuming a level of responsibility and accountability. There are some initiatives that are happening around changing deeds, so that those covenants that are not enforceable anymore, but there still are in those deeds, right, that you cannot sell to Black people and sometimes even Irish people, right? So we went that far. So, and that could be just a symbolic reparation. And then if our elected officials and people will come up with some ideas around reparation, you can do local solutions. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to pay people financially. Oh, that's not off the table, especially if you can trace a level of harm to a specific individual or family. But there are policies that you can be implementing today to help communities that are already embedded in specific communities, to help them build wealth and to help them escape poverty. This can be even race neutral policies, because if you come from the school of we do not want to do things that are race oriented so that it doesn't look discriminatory against white people, you could absolutely invest in childcare. You could be investing in opportunities for people to own their own housing, as opposed to live in a cycle of rent where you cannot, the moment you're out of the specific poverty line, you're out of housing, which in the Bay Area is ridiculous because you cannot buy anything else or move anything else. So looking at those policies that are absolutely neutral, but are keeping people in poverty, will be a form of reparation that you could start evaluating and being very specific about the type of measures or the type of, even if it's a moral compensation or a financial compensation, that will at least bring accountability for the harm that has been caused for violating individual fundamental rights that Black people in this country have. And they have just been recognized, but they have always had that because they're human beings, and that's why they have those rights. So
Absolutely.
that's how I see that. And I really encourage everyone to read that essay because it's really transformational.
Thank you. And I want to plug some of our future programs because we are talking about in subsequent events, we're going to be talking about the case for reparations. And in fact, I like that question so much. Royce, I'm going to ask you that in just a moment, the same question. But we're also talking about school segregation and the ways in which these governmental decisions affect have life and death consequences for people who are living in poverty, and that is usually Black, Indigenous, and Latina people who end up living in that lowest level of poverty to a disproportionate amount. We're talking about real harm, real life and death harm. If you're living in a place where there is vermin, where there is lead in the pipes, where it's substandard housing, you have physical harm. And if that is the only place you can live because of the laws, then the laws are causing you and your family, you and your people, back generations, physical harm. So we can talk about some of those things, and we will have a larger conversation about that coming up. I believe in March, we're going to be discussing that. So please stay tuned. And Royce, I'm going to ask you the same question because I like it so much. So let me see. What are your thoughts about the idea of reparations, and what do you think reparations would look like in the community that you're a part of?
Well, I think that Easy said Golden Gate Village is just one to be put into a community land trust. Our shopping center under new ownership, and, embrace opening it up for Black businesses to be able to, fulfill their dreams, as well as, as it relates to other housing throughout Marin City, that there be some sort of way of a land trust, and everything that would be bought up would be put into this land trust, so that people who wanted to come back to live in Marin City could have opportunities to come back. And I'm not just, must we all, be sitting side by side? No, I mean, we have our different cultures, and we have a right to respect, differences in our people. But it's always, I find it amusing when you talk about really creating or recreating, Black community, that people want to start talking about, well, we need to integrate, but Marin City is the most integrated community in Marin County.
Right.
So, so what's happening is they want to move us out of our community, and that's the underlying thing. But I definitely believe that it would be a step in the right direction. Golden Gate Village, give us the land. Number two, I think it would be another step in the right direction to open the opportunity for the black, for Black businesses, not just in Marin City, but throughout the county.
Yes.
I understand too, as it relates to, I had mentioned it before, that Black people are not really the workforce of Marin County anymore. But what happens is that when this whole affordable income, building affordable income throughout this county, initially I thought, oh, they must be thinking that it's, Black people. But then I was at one of the Board of Supervisors meeting and heard how the different white people were just up in arms because they did not want any affordable housing built in their neighborhood. And so then I spoke on it. I said, well, Black people, for the most part, cannot afford affordable. But then it dawned on me later that it is the Hispanic population is who that they were talking about. And, yeah, that's because they feel they're good enough to do their domestic work and their hard labor, but they don't want them as next door neighbors.
Right.
I mean, that's the bottom line. And so what we are seeing and what I've heard as it relates to the canal and the high real estate, the wheeling and dealing, that is because those officials that we don't really see, that they have a vision for the canal. And that vision is to open it up and have water taxis and condos and restaurants all the way to the bridge. But then what's happening is they want to, at the expense of moving Black people out of Marin City, to open it up for other nationalities, to want to build more, stockpiling, in here, to force Black people out because we've outlived our usefulness. And so that is, where the rubber hits the road as it relates to, Marin City.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think you brought up some really excellent points about how often these development of communities are done not for the people who are living there. They are done at the expense of the people who are living there.
That's right.
And so when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about mitigating harm that has been done and that harm that could be done and harm that is being done. So we're looking at addressing those issues that are connecting to the people who live there in those ways. So I appreciate you highlighting that. And some of the things that you're talking about, again, we will be discussing in future events, especially the idea of desegregation and how that is often a decision that is made for communities of color. It always seems to be a community of colors. We are going to desegregate your communities, but there is no desegregation that's happening in white communities. No pathways for home ownership in white communities. And so when you're talking about that, that is often the way it happens. When you have development, it's happening in poor communities. When you have desegregation, it's happening in poor communities. Instead of having white schools become desegregated, you have to admit more people of color. Instead of having white communities be desegregated, your neighborhood should have X amount of housing for low-income residents. Each neighbor should have X amount of housing for low-income residents, and that includes single-family units, that includes condos, that includes apartments. It should not always be all those separate things. So I think there is a lot that we can discuss, and we will discuss at future events, but I thank you for highlighting that. That's perfect. I'm going to start asking some individual questions of you folks, and then we are also at we have 25 minutes left. So I do want to save some space. I'm going to take the next 10 minutes though and ask these questions of our panelists before we open it up for community questions. Lucia, you worked for years in the canal, and you still do, serving the immigrant community. You continue to advocate for immigrant justice. What do you think are misconceptions that people have about the immigrant community here in Marin? And what are some of the things you would like to say and speak to in that way?
Yeah, good question. So there are, around immigration, there's so many myths around, how people come to this country, or what are the problems that supposedly immigrants bring to the country, etc. And I think one of the things that I think people have a sometimes hard time, understanding is like, it's very hard to come to the United States. There's no such thing as get in the back of a line. There's no line to get in the back. There's no such thing. There's an immigrant trying to come to the United States, if you're low income, and even if you're high income, sometimes it's very difficult to find an avenue to come to the US. There's very limited ways in which people can be here. And that is important to highlight, because then you feel like you put the responsibility on the individuals, like why you don't have legal status, or why is it that you cannot apply for a work permit, or why is it that you don't have a social security number or US citizenship, right? So I want to bring that to the table, that is really complicated, right? And also immigrants also come here for different reasons, and sometimes I feel that immigrants are diverse even within themselves. Just like you're trying to talk about politics and you talk about Latinos and you put us all in this bucket, right? It's like, no, we're not all the same. We're also not the same. Not all immigrants are the same. Not all come from the United States for the same reasons. But it is true that a lot of folks that have come to Marin County that are socioeconomically disadvantaged obviously have become coming because of economic or political pressures, mostly in Central America and in Mexico, but mostly in Central America right now. And the other thing is that one of the myths is around the economic impact of immigrants, right? So this is one of the areas where I have a little bit of a hard time, because I do not want to tie the dignity of human beings with, the totality of their economic contribution. But there is, in fact, an economic contribution for immigrants, and immigrants of all kinds. And in fact, Black immigrants in this country from Nigeria are the ones who are the most educated immigrants in the United States. So you are talking about a variety of folks that are contributing in many ways, either by getting a job in the service industry, in healthcare, or by working in technology or other high-paying jobs. So there is a variety of contributions that the immigrant community as a whole are making to the economy and the multiculturalism of the country. And I think that's something that I think we need to highlight. But there is this conception too that we are depressing wages, and that's something that I have to say. It's complicated when you are talking about the immigrant community and then you talk about other communities that have been affected by racism and other structural issues in the United States. It is possible that in some industry, for some time, immigration may have an impact on certain wages, but that actually levels out at the end, except in some industries, because of structural pressures that don't allow those salaries to go up. So for example, we know that in construction, the salaries around construction are higher than a teacher right now. And that is an industry highly dominated, at least the construction workers, by immigrants. So that ultimately was not what decided whether or not the wages stayed low. But other areas are actually also, in many cases, done for women of color and immigrants, especially in Marin County. And those wages are still quite low, that don't allow people to have economic mobility. But it's not immigrants' fault necessarily, because of that wages that are stagnant or are low. So that's another misconception around immigration and what happens. And ultimately, you know, one of the other misconceptions have to do with crime, right? A lot of times we do have this idea that, you know, crime is, you know, embedded with immigration, and crime is a very complicated social phenomenon, right? So I think it's very complicated just to say that's one thing or the other. So, but I wanted to say that that's one of the other things that I do hear in Marin County sometimes, right? But that happens to many communities of color anyway, where the crime, you know, it's being blamed on other communities and not seeing it in other aspects. So I will say that that's some of the things that I feel are important to highlight, and understand a little bit of what it's like to be an immigrant in the United States, and what are the myths around immigration that I think are important to highlight.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I think you're bringing up some really good points. The intersectionality of people who are immigrants, they're all different ethnicities, one. Two, all different ways that they are already contributing to our communities, is two. But, and also, you know, kind of this idea of personal, we tend to treat poverty as a personal failing instead of treating our neighbors as human beings, you know, with a understanding that any human being placed in these deeply impoverished conditions, with very little opportunities to grow and be able to develop economically, develop emotionally, develop educationally, would be in the same position. And we saw that played out in places like New York, when you have different immigrants coming from all over, and they were packed into housing, and or, you know, segregated into this, you're allowed to live here and nowhere else. The same conditions and the same problems arose in those communities as well. It is a human thing, and we need to recognize that, and not allow misconceptions of us versus them, the othering of other people to make us think, okay, this is their problem, and not, this is our problem, that we've created this situation where these kind of problems are going to develop. So I think, thank you so much for pointing that out. Royce, my next question is for you, and then I'm going to open it up to the community. You have lived in Marin City for decades, and you have seen things change and also stay the same. Can you share with us some of the ways in which you have seen the effects of discriminatory practices and redlining happening in Marin City and in Marin County for the past and the present? And how would you say that those incidences have impacted the Golden Gate Village residents?
The redlining, and it still exists.
Yes.
However, I see it that there are quite a few people. There's, back in the day, as a Black person, you would consider, well, you've made it if in fact you've moved into a white neighborhood, regardless of how you were treated. I think now it's not, it's not an issue of me making it by being able to live in a white neighborhood or any neighborhood. So just to be able to create a neighborhood with where you live, regardless of who makes up your neighborhood. My neighborhood is really very integrated, and we all get along, really, together. And so that's, that is life. But I think opportunities should be made available for, particularly for people who have Marin City roots, that if they want to come back here and their families contributed to World War II, that they should be given that opportunity, to come back. There's a young man who bought this property up on the hill. It's called the Summit of Sausalito. I'm waiting for him to change to the Summit of Marin City. But he's told me that the reason why he bought this piece of property that, you know, it's been market rate ever since they tricked the community to build it back in the 80s, is because of the gentrification that has happened here. And so he wanted to, you know, you're either poor and living in public housing, or you're, you know, living in now almost $1 million homes here in Marin City.
Right.
So there's no in between. So he wants to, that's why he bought the property. People who in fact were from Marin City and want to come back to their community, that an opportunity would be made for them to be able to return. So I think that, you know, within itself, people feel on a whole nother level that we didn't talk about is, you know, with not only with law enforcement. So it's safer here for Black people in Marin City than anywhere else within the county.
Right.
So, you know, which is, you know, another reason in terms of, and knowing that we're living in a police state.
Right. Right.
But it is still a safer place to be than really probably anywhere else in the county.
I think that you're bringing up a really good point about the ways in which policing is, especially when you're seen as not being in the right place for people of color, and how immediate the police presence is to make sure that you're back in your place. I think that brings up a really good point. And then when you are in the place that everybody has decided is okay for people of color to be, you tend to be left alone to some extent.
However, I do want to add, there is a new group of trainees, rookies, and there's a young mother sitting in her car, just trying to get away from her children. And she's just sitting there, and here they pulled up on her and asked her, "What are you doing here?"
Right.
What? You know, so it comes and goes, and this is a new group of rookies that are in law enforcement and trying to make a name for themselves. So, you know, you got to put the heat on, I guess it's going to be Sardina, you know, that quit making Marin City the training ground, because it's been the training ground. So you think that mindset, who are they really training, you know, for, why, who?
Right. Right. And that we're talking about feeling welcome in your own community. And having like why don't some people feel welcome in their own community? And it's things like this. I can't sit in my car and take a breather without being harassed. These are things that people need to, like, the greater community needs to hear about it, for one. And two, we need to share these stories openly and say, no, you know, I want somebody in Marin City to feel comfortable taking a walk anywhere in Marin without being harassed, the same way that, you know, somebody who is white, who is from Fairfax, is, you know, walking around in anywhere in Marin is left alone and allowed to exist and be in space. So, you know, there's several things socially, economically, that need to happen throughout Marin in order to change our mind, our way of thinking of things, our way of thinking about our neighbors, of all different ethnicities and races. So I appreciate you bringing that out. That is disheartening, and we've got work to do. But I do want to open this up to the community, and then I might come back if we have time and ask a couple of more questions. Lucia, you mentioned the bowling alley. One of our community members wanted to know more about that. Can you share briefly on what you were saying about the bowling alley?
Yeah, so I don't have, the only information I know is that a while back, some developers and some folks made a purchase of that property with the intent to convert, I don't know if to housing development, probably it's a housing development, and that they were not able to execute on that because of various economic reasons around the neighborhood. But I think that it's possible that the bowling alley, however, is going to be closing relatively soon. And that's not the only property. There's other properties around the neighborhood that are being purchased. So I don't have more details about that, but I think maybe we could do a Google search real quick and see what's going on. But that's something that is happening, and it's in the, it's going to be executed very soon. We may see some construction happening in the canal in the near future. There's some people like Canal Alliance trying to purchase housing so that they can do affordable housing, but we're talking about 12 units, 20 units or something like that, right? But in order to do, a lot more, to undo some of the damage, you will have to buy a lot more properties to do that.
Absolutely.
But there's some initiatives. There's some initiatives there to purchase those housing and make them managed by a nonprofit so that they can stay within the community to avoid the displacement that is obviously going to happen when this type of developments start.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely going to be some changes coming up. And so this is why we need to share this information so that we are able to speak up for people and make sure that all of our neighbors have a place to live in our neighborhoods. This question is for both Royce and Lucia. Can you share a little bit about the barriers that people face once they start making, I'm going to put quotes around this, too much money to stay in their respective communities where they've been kind of grouped and gathered?
Rose, you want to take this question? and then I can jump in if you want.
Okay. Well, I think, and I don't know this personally, but I believe that if you have enough money, really in this day and time, regardless of your nationality, that you could almost go anywhere that you want. I mean, I might be naive, but if you got the money, and that's why you have like sprinkles of Black people throughout the county that were able to really, to leave, or move here, because you have Black people that are moving to Marin County and don't want to be associated that they've had or have any ties or anything in Marin City. So, I mean, you've got that too. But no, I think again, I might be naive, but I think that if you have the money, you can, because with money comes the influence. You can move anywhere you want in this county. If they may not want you there, but then they want to play like they're not racist, so they'll welcome you to our neighborhood. I mean, that's how I see it.
I think you're right. I think even when there is no legal impediment to moving someplace, there are social impediments. How are you treated? And this is something we discussed during our last event. For families of color that do manage to move into white neighborhoods that are predominantly white, the bricks thrown through their windows, they had to fear, reprisals or censure. They were not made to feel like welcome members of the community. And and so there's a social thing there too.
Is that still going on here? Because I know back in the day, that's another reason why people were still in Marin City. Those that did make it out, yes, they had crosses burned on their houses and the whole 9 yards. So I thought maybe we've gone, past that.
I'm speaking historically.
Okay.
I think now there is more what you see with people being, what you're seeing is more policing. When people of color are in kind of predominantly white neighborhoods, that kind of welcome mat is pulled up and they're seen as other and not belonging. I think it's more that kind of thing, having the police called on them for not being where people expect them to be. That kind of thing is more, I think, prevalent nowadays. but it's an ongoing fight to be seen as part of the community that you've lived in for generations. That's a problem. So that's something socially that we need to work on. Lucia, did you have any thoughts, for families that make too much money? And what happens?
We have to change the policy. So this is the thing. We are talking about benefits cliff. We're talking about structural issues that are happening around eligibility for programs in the United States. And this happens at the federal level. This happens at the state level. We have a cycle in which people have, in order to be able to be part of welfare or be part in welfare, I said in a positive way, not in a negative connotation that it has, but to be able to take advantage of safety net programs, you have to be in such a low income rate that it is very difficult to have social mobility when you are stuck in that, welfare cliff, what they call the welfare cliff. So there's got to be an intentional transformation on how we look at benefits, including benefits around housing. Right. So some folks have talked about vouchers, for example, because, and I don't have all the answers around housing. And I think very few people will say that they do. Yeah. Right. But the solution around housing, it has to come through different lenses. And I think the lens has to be around building a path as opposed to getting people stuck in a situation, right? And whether it's in your own neighborhood where you grew up and you want to stay there, or versus, as Royce mentioned, people should be willing to move anywhere. Like I have moved 3 times through different continents, right? Like I may have less attachment to places, but if you want to stay attached to one place, you also should have the opportunity. Absolutely. It should be a choice and not a man-made infrastructural problem. And that's what I'm most calling, like, we cannot continue to have programs in which you lose your public housing because you make a little bit too much money, or you have a neighbor or you have a family member who is living with you. And those are the type of things that we need to really revisit and understand that has to be completely dismantled and transformed in order to be able to help people and support them through a trajectory outside of poverty.
Absolutely. And throughout their lives, we think about the freedoms that you have if you're, basic life stuff. Your parents become elderly and they need to move in with you. If you own your own home, nobody says boo to you when that happens. If you're living in apartments, that could be something your whole family ends up homeless for. So like these kind of things, these laws, these policies that are allowed to remain in place, where people are struggling and they're living on the knife's edge, and any little thing can kind of knock them off. That's true. When we're talking about affordable housing, it can't just be this one narrow little, you can have it as long as you make under this amount of money, etc. And then after that, all the safety nets are pulled away and you're left to fall on your own. There has to be a place where it's scaffolded support throughout life changes, normal human life changes. Those things should be taken into consideration, and not penalize people for things like that. Thank you for bringing that up and highlighting that, Lucia, and Royce as well. That's excellent form. I had a question here about Mill Valley. I don't have any specific information about Mill Valley, but we will, I'll look into it. And you can always email me at rscar@marincounty.org, and I can do a little reference work for you and see if I can find out more of that, and I can email you back with some information for our community member who asked about that. Let me see, sorry, just looking at here at the chat. Sorry. Someone asked, could you please ask Royce to speak a little more on the, I'm sorry, I keep losing it. Can somebody read that out for me?
On the CLT, I'm thinking that's the Community Land Trust as a form of reparations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Royce, can you speak a little bit about the Community Land Trust as a form of reparations?
Yes, that through a community land trust, which is a part of our plan, that we are asking the county, basically, we want the land. That's the least that they can do. And from that, we would be able to secure affordable, what's affordable if you're poor.
Right.
They will be able to afford and earn some limited equity in their homes. So this is a start as it relates to, you know, to generational wealth. They may, you know, whatever little equity they get, that they can pass it on. One other good thing about community land trusts, you'd be able to, you know, give it to a family member for next generation. That's enough to get a good toehold back in Marin City, because like I said, once people really see that in fact it's, you know, more Black people are returning to the community, then it's gonna, you know, lose the character that brought people here. They will be leaving, and you know, opportunity for more Black people to be able to return to the community of their youth.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an excellent point of highlighting the ways in which we're building back these communities, but we're doing it in a way that treats the people who are already there as part of the community, and not as, oh, we're allowing you to have this space, but as, this is your space, this is your family space, and you are part of our community. This community is your space too.
That's right.
So I feel like there is room there for a lot of growth in both the canal areas, in Golden Gate Village area, and in wider Marin community, where space is made for everyone. And so we're going to talk about more of that at future events. I went ahead and put our the links to some of these different centers. I should also add the Canal Alliance. If somebody can add the link for the Canal Alliance in that as well. So please do check that out. We are at time. I want to thank each of you for being here. I want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. I think this is an important one, and we're going to continue the conversation in January with the relationship between school segregation and housing segregation. So we hope that you will join us for that conversation as well. Thank you again to Lucia Martel-Dow and Royce McElmore for coming and joining us and speaking to some of these issues. I think we are really touching on some really important things. And I think the more we talk about it, the more knowledge we have and the greater ability we will have to affect change. I do want to ask our speakers to stay on for a few minutes after we have finished with our conversation with the community. And thank you all for being here. Take care.
Thank you.